Welcome to Server-Side Web Development. This is Lecture 2. Today, we are going to be covering conditional statements, loops, functions, and debugging all in PHP. So these should be some familiar topics to you since everyone has gone through Introduction to JavaScript and we cover these same topics in JavaScript. They are very, very similar in PHP as well. Both languages, of course, are based off of the same grandfather language, which is C. So they have very similar syntaxes. So I think you'll pick up on these structures very easily. We'll also be talking, we'll also have a participation exercise. So we'll talk about your participation exercise, deck of cards, and then your exercise dominoes. Now, before I get started, are there any questions? Okay, I'll take the silence as that there is no questions. So we'll just go ahead and get started. Conditional statements. All right, so we've used conditional statements in JavaScript, and we know that conditional statements are ways of controlling the flow of a program. So a program typically flows from top to bottom, executing each line of code. The conditional statement allows us to execute certain lines of code depending on specific conditions. The same is true in PHP. Now, PHP has two types of conditional statements. It has the if statement and it has the switch statement. We will not be covering the switch statement in this course. If you are interested in it, there is content out on the web that you can take a look at the switch statement, but we'll just be focusing on the if statement in this course. So let's go ahead and take a look at the if-else statements in PHP. So just like in JavaScript, the if statement will execute a block of code if its expression is true or truthy. We also have the else statement that we can add to the if statement, which will give us an alternate block of code to execute if the expression is false, if the if expression is false. Then we have an an else if statement, which allows us to check for multiple conditions. Now, take note, that is not a typo. In PHP, we have the else if as one word, no space in there. That is an actual statement. With that said, PHP will also accept it separated as well, else if, just like in JavaScript. But it will only work with curly braces. Now I'm going to show you some examples of where that comes into play. All right, so here we go. Here's our first example with our our if statement. So we have a couple of variables right at the top here. We have A3 and B4. Now we're doing our if else statement here. We do if A is greater than B, then we'll execute this. Then we have our if else. So we know that from looking at our variables that A is not greater than B. So this statement here will be false. So we'll skip over this echo statement and it will never be executed, and we'll jump to our else if and run that command, or check that condition there, which is saying that A is less than B, which is true. So we'll echo out this statement here. And if neither one of these were true, then we would, of course, fall back on our else. Again, very similar to JavaScript. Now, you can see here in this next slide, it was really quick, but you notice that we have that space here. This is also acceptable. Will be completely functional PHP, and it will execute properly. So you can use one word else if, or have the space. Either is acceptable. Now, I'm going to show you a different way of writing this, which is without the curly braces. So this is something in PHP. We don't have the equivalent in JavaScript, but in PHP, we can forego the curly braces for colons. So here we have our if with our condition and then our colon. And notice that we don't have any closing thing. We just jump to our else if then, right, as one word, and then we do another colon and so forth. We end the whole thing with this end if. This is important. Because we're not using curly braces to close up our if statement, we need to use this end if here. Now, if we were to try and use these colons with the else if with a space in between, what we're going to get, or we'll get an error. This just will not compile. You will receive an error and it will cause some problems. So just make sure that you use just the else if as one word if you're going to use colons. Now, we will be using colons when we talk about intertwining PHP with HTML. We will rely on colons a lot for that because it makes the interface a little bit cleaner. All right. Any questions about if statements? Fairly straightforward.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do we have to use the indent for the colon format of the code?
No, you don't. It's not. No indentation formatting is necessary to use it. Okay, so you can just do the colon and then you write your next else if, or the colon works for other statements as well, loops and so forth. But you don't need to have any specific tabbing or indentation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about loops now. So just like in JavaScript, PHP has loops, and loops are used to carry out repetitive tasks or repeat blocks of code. There are the three most common loops in PHP are the while loop, the for loop, and the for each loop. And we'll go through each of these in turn. So let's first talk about the while loop. Now, in JavaScript, we didn't really spend that much time with the while loop, but the while loop is a little bit more useful in PHP, especially when we start working with databases. That's where we'll start using the while loop a lot more. But the while loop essentially will continue its loop as long as the condition, the while loop condition, is true. Now, the while loop can be used in pretty much every situation. Any situation where you need to repeat a task or repeat a block of code, the while loop can be used in that situation. But it is often best to be used when the number of iterations, the number of times we need to repeat, is unknowable. And again, this is not that you don't know what the answer is. It means the number of iterations is unknowable. It's a random amount. It can't be known. That's when we typically need to use the while loop. I'm going to show you an example of that here in a moment. All right, so here's just a basic example of using the while loop, and this while loop is set up to loop essentially 10 times. So we start with the top here with a variable count that we've set to 1. Then we have our while loop, and inside of our while loop, we're asking for count to, as long as we have a condition, and as long as count is less than or equal to 10, then we're going to continue looping. So we know the first time that count is 1, so it's going to go inside and execute its code. We have this echo statement, which is going to echo out the count. So it will echo out 1, comma, space. And then this is vital. We are incrementing count here. So we're increasing the value of count by 1. So we're using that count plus plus. If you remember from JavaScript, we use plus plus to increment a number by 1. Same way, it works the same way in PHP as well. So this will essentially output the numbers 1 through 10. Now, if we did not have that count plus plus there, if we forget to add it, what we're going to end up having is an infinite loop. And this will ultimately crash your server or whatever. Some servers have built in to actually help prevent a crash, but an infinite loop will continue forever until memory runs out. So we want to avoid infinite loops. Now, the more common way of using the while loop, again, is when the number of iterations is unknown, where we have some sort of randomness inside of the logic. So here's an example. We have a coin, right? And we want to keep flipping the coin until we get heads. And we're using 0 and 1, where 0 is head and 1 is tails. So we set the coin to tails by default so that our while loop will continue looping as long as coin is not 0, essentially. So when you deal with conditions, by the way, the number 0 is considered false and every other number is considered true. So that is a way you can kind of use numbers for Boolean work. So we're setting it to 1, so it's a true value. Coin is a true value. But if it was 0, then it would be false. Then we have this rand function. Now, rand allows us to create random numbers. You'll get a chance to work with this in your exercises. So this rand number will basically determine or give us a random number between 0 and 1, including both. So we can have 0 or 1, and it'll give us one of those, and it's going to set it to coin. And then we're going to echo out the result of that. So as long as random here continues to give us 1, this loop will continue. So we don't know how many times that will be. Just like a coin, if you're flipping a coin, you don't know exactly how many times you're going to flip that coin until you get heads. It could be 1 time, it could be 100 times. This can only be done with the while loop. We can't use any of the other loops, the for loop or the for each loop, to do a situation like this. All right, so that is the while loop. It is the most simple of the loops as well. So let's go ahead and move on to our next loop, which is the for loop. Now, the for loop, just like in JavaScript, in PHP consists of 3 parts, and that is the initialization, the condition, and iteration. So the first part, the initialization, will initialize our iterator, and then the condition will be checked before each loop or each time the loop iterates. And if that condition is true, it will execute the block of code inside of the loop. Then the iteration is executed at the end of the loop. So once it's gone through the block of code, it will iterate the iterator. It will add 1 to it or subtract 1 to it, depending on how your iteration works. And then it will continue looping as long as that condition is true. So let's take a look at an example. So here is an example similar to our first while loop example, where we're basically taking a loop that's going to loop 10 times and output the numbers 1 to 10. So we are initializing our iterator, $count equals 1. That is very similar to our while loop where we created that variable outside of the while loop. Then we have our condition, count is less than or equal to 10. That is the same condition that we had for our while loop. Then we have our iteration, count plus plus. We had this inside of our while loop. So that's showing you that we could use the while loop for this, but the for loop allows us to do it all in a single line or in a single expression. It makes it a little bit cleaner to work with. And then, of course, then we're echoing out our count. All right, so the for loop can also be used for iterating over arrays. So just like in JavaScript, we can iterate over arrays using the for loop. We can do the same thing with PHP. So here we have an array of ages where we have just a series of numbers. Then we are going to get the length of the array or the number of items in the array. And we do this using the count function. Okay, so the count function looks like this. We do count, and then inside of parentheses, we would pass in the array. So this will give us the number of items in the array, and in this case is 6. So count here will equal 6. Then we have our for loop. We will still initialize our iterator. We're using I here. We're setting it equal to 0. Then we're going I is less than count. So as long as I is less than the number of items in the array, then it's going to continue looping. Then we do I plus plus, and we have our echo statement inside of our for loop. So this will output each age inside of the array. So the for loop can be used for just normal iterations, for looping or repeating a block of code a certain number of times. It can also be used for arrays. Now, it's important to note that this will only work for indexed arrays. Last week, we talked about that we have two types of arrays. We have indexed arrays and we have associative arrays. This will only work for indexed arrays. It will not work for associative arrays. And that is because of right here, which I skipped over a little bit, is that when we're calling an item in from the arrays, we're using that iterator as the index, just like we did in JavaScript. So we do that square brackets, and then we pass that index in there. So I will equal 0, that'll give us the first one, and then so forth, it will jump to each one. But with associative arrays, we don't have that index, we have a string. So this will not work for indexed arrays. To fix that, we have the for each loop. So the for each loop is specifically designed to iterate over arrays. So it will work with both indexed arrays and associative arrays. And the way it works is, or the expression for the for each is broken down like this. We will start with the array. So the variable holding the array or the literal array. Then we'll have the as keyword, and then the variable, which will, sorry, that says old, should be hold, which will hold the items of the values. All right, so you can think of the for each loop very similar to the for of loop inside of JavaScript. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that they are flipping the order of the variables. So in this case, we start with the array and we end with the variable holding the items. Whereas in the for of loop, we start with a variable holding the items and then end with the array. So it kind of flips it around. All right, let's look at an example. So here is that same example we saw for our for loop where we're iterating over the array. We still have our ages here, except for now we're going to use the for each loop. So we use for each. Then inside of our parentheses, we have ages. That is our array. Then we have the as keyword and then age. Age here will hold the value of each age one at a time for each iteration of this loop. And then we can just output age because this will hold the value. So this is a much cleaner way of working or iterating over arrays as opposed to using the for loop. Now, the other advantage of the for each loop is that it will work with associative arrays, which cannot be done with the for loop. So here is an associative array. We have person, and it has two key value pairs. It has name with the value Michael, and the key title with the value of professor. So we have two properties or two key value pairs here, which we want to iterate over. So here, for when we want to iterate over an associative array, we can do, again, the for each, and we call our array person. Then we do the as keyword just like before, but here we can do a combination of things. If we have just a single value, then it will retrieve the value of the each key value pair. But if we do something similar to this, where we do key, then that fat arrow, and then value, we can get both the key and the value. Now, please note that you do not need to use key and value here. These are variables. You can call them whatever you want. But just note that the first one will return the key and the second one will return the value. And of course, once we echo this out, we'll echo out each key value pair. All right, so any questions about the loops that we covered, the while loop, the for loop, or the for each loop? Again, these are very similar to what we saw in JavaScript. Okay, so if there's no questions, we'll move on to our next topic, which is functions. All right, so functions are blocks of code that can be executed at some point in the future. So we worked with functions in JavaScript. Same concept in PHP. In fact, they're built very similar as well. So functions are defined using the function keyword, a name, set of parentheses, and a set of curly braces, just like we did in JavaScript with the function definition. All right, so and then just like in JavaScript, a function will not execute until it is called or invoked. So we call a function by using the function's names followed by a set of parentheses. Now a function can have multiple parameters, and when it does, you need to pass those arguments to the function when it is called. We can also return a value using the return statement. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here is a very simple function. So we have our function keyword. Then we have the name of our function, say hello. We have a set of parentheses and we have a set of curly braces. Then inside of our function, we have an echo statement that says hello world. This will not do anything. It will just sit there until it is called. We can call it by calling the name of the function, say hello, and a set of parentheses. And then this will output hello world. All right, so let's take a look at another example. This one has parameters and arguments. So at the top, we have an add function. Again, function add, set of parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we are setting our parameters. So we have two parameters here. We have an A and a B. We separate them by a comma. Then we have our return statement. So remember, the return statement will return the value of our function. And for this one, because it's add, we're just adding the two parameters together. So we have A plus B, and we'll get the value back. So when we invoke this function, we will do add, then pass the value. So we're passing 3, 4, and this will give us the result of 7. This will be saved to the variable result 1. Then we have it again where we're calling add again. So we do add 5, result 1. So now we're passing that 7 that we've stored into result 1 as a result of calling add. And now we will get 12 for result 2. All right, any questions about using functions? Very basic, because we're going to move on to variable scope. All right, so variable scope, this is very important. We talked about scope in JavaScript. So just as a reminder, scope is basically the concept that variables are only accessible at certain places in a program. In JavaScript, we are generally don't have to worry about scope as much because we're generally under global scope with everything we do. So when we created a variable anywhere outside of a function, that variable is accessible anywhere in the program, even inside of functions. PHP does not work that way, which is what I'm going to explain here. So we have inside of PHP, we have two types of functions. We have two types of scope. We have global scope and we have local scope. So variables defined inside of a function are in local scope. It's local to that function, and they're only available inside of that function. This is the same as it is in JavaScript. So when we created a variable inside of a function in JavaScript, that variable only existed inside of that function. But now here's where things differ. A variable defined outside of a function has global scope. That's true in JavaScript as well. And it's available everywhere except inside of a function. So this is different, and This tends to trip people up right at first when they're working with PHP. If you define a variable outside of a function, that function by default doesn't have access to that variable. In order to get access to that variable, you must use the global keyword to be able to use that global variable. All right, so let's take a look at an example. So here is an example. We are defining a variable a. We're setting it equal to 1. This is defined outside of a function, so it has global scope. Now we create a function, test, and we're returning a. Well, we might be thinking that, oh, we're returning the a up here in global scope. But remember, global scope is not accessible inside the function. And this a here is actually local scope. And so if we were to invoke test, what we're going to get back is null, because a has never been giving a value, so it defaults to the null value. By the way, this var dump, because this is the first time we're seeing var dump here, I'll talk a little bit more about var dump later, but just note that this is another way of outputting data to the browser. This is typically used, though, only for development purposes. All right, so how do we fix this problem? Well, that's where that global keyword comes in. So here, once again, we are using that a. We're defining a outside of a function, so it has global scope. Then inside of our function, we're going to retrieve a using global, the global keyword, global a. This will now set a link to the global scope a inside of our function, so that when we return a, it's returning the global scope a. And when we run test, we will get back 1. Does everyone see how that works? This is something that you kind of have to get used to and remember, because it will trip you up. Typically, we won't be really using variables outside of functions. We'll typically pass parameters or arguments to the functions and get the data that way. All right, so any questions about anything we've covered so far with conditional statements?
I have a question.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes. With the global scope, why do we need to write the global keyword? Hello?
Yeah, why do we need to write the global keyword? So inside of PHP, global variables or global scoped variables, variables that are defined outside of any function, are not accessible inside of a function. It has to do with the fact that we don't actually declare variables. Remember, inside of JavaScript, we have those declaration statements that allow us to declare variables. Well, in PHP, we just start using variables. And because of that, using a variable automatically defines its scope based on where it is. So if we try and use a variable inside of a function, it automatically gets local scope. So PHP doesn't understand whether or not we want the global scope when we're inside of a function. So we have to use that keyword to tell PHP, no, I want the global scope version of this variable. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other questions before we move on to debugging?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on to debugging. So with PHP, it's going to happen. You're going to run into problems with your code. You're going to write a bunch of code. You can run your browser, and most of the time, or sometimes you'll just get this blank white screen. I like calling it the white screen of death, because you'll have all this code and it just outputs nothing. And that is very common with PHP, because the way PHP works, if you're looking in the browser, you get nothing. And with JavaScript, we had the console that let us know what errors are going. With PHP, we have some of that, but it's not as nice. Okay, so we do have some error handling going on that sometimes pushes out to the browser, but it doesn't always. So I'm going to first cover some common problems that you'll likely run into when you get that white screen. So the first thing you want to make sure is that your server is running, because this will catch you up. It's like, oh, right, I need to have my PHP server running, and it's not, and that's why I'm not getting anything, because it's going to say, I don't know what to do with this PHP file. All right, so this is mostly for Windows. On a Mac. If you've installed Valet, Valet just runs all the time. It automatically starts when you log into your machine, and it's just running in the background. With Windows, because you're using Laragon you actually do turn off, and so you just want to make sure you have that running when you're working on your projects. So the server not running, make sure you have your server running. The next one is that PHP is not working. Now, hopefully at this point, you've already tested your install following the videos, and you've tested to make sure that your PHP is actually working. Again, you want to be able to test this. You can always use that PHP info function. That's the easiest way to check that your PHP is working. Just run that function. If you get back the PHP info page, then you're good to go. After those first two very common DOI moments, either the server's not working or PHP is not working, then you need to go on to syntax errors. Now, syntax errors are when we've made a problem with our code. And these, fortunately, are pretty easy to fix, but they can occur frequently, especially for beginners, as you're getting used to the syntax of the language. So syntax errors can include typos. This is misspelling variable names or functions, missing semicolons. This is a big one, especially as we're coming off of JavaScript, because in Introduction to JavaScript, we didn't really use semicolons, and in PHP, we have to use semicolons. So we have to add those semicolons. So that's a big one. Missing a bracket or a quote. This is missing the closing one. This can cause an error as well. Misspelling a variable name. All these can cause, which are known as syntax errors, right? So these are things to take a look at when you get a problem with your code. Now, we have, if you've followed your development tools, you should have the errors, the display errors turned on. And if you're able to install the Xdebug, then you should be getting error messages when you make a mistake, and they will be displayed in the browser. Now, when it displays those errors, it's going to tell you what type of error occurs. And there are different types of errors for PHP. We have fatal errors. We have parse errors. These are syntax errors. We have warnings and notices. These are not so much errors as much as just things that you're not quite doing right, and you might want to rethink doing them. And then finally, we have deprecated. And deprecated are most likely functions that you're using that are going to be removed from PHP, so you probably shouldn't be using them anymore. All right, so let me talk a little bit about each. The first one is fatal errors. Now, fatal errors are the ones you really want to avoid because they will halt your program. When the PHP server reaches a fatal error, it just stops and outputs whatever it has. It just says, no, I don't know what to do. Okay, so here is an example of a fatal error, and this is the undefined function. This is typically caused by a typo. So we can see here, I have an array, and I'm trying to output the array using var dump. So you can see that we have used, it should be var dump with a p, but the p has been missing. So there is no function called var underscore dump. And so therefore we have an undefined function. And when PHP reaches an undefined function, it causes a fatal error. All right. And again, we want to definitely avoid the fatal errors because it just kills everything. The next one are the parse errors. This is your syntax errors. Now, syntax errors, like fatal errors, will also halt the program. PHP just doesn't know what to do, and it will just stop and throw the error. And probably the most common syntax error you're going to run into, especially starting off, is the missing semicolon. So we can see right here in the array, we are missing a semicolon after the array. And this is bad because PHP just sees it, doesn't know what's going on. And again, it's just going to throw that error. When we get these errors, what will typically happen, especially with the parse error, with the syntax error, what will happen is we'll get back something saying parse error, missing semicolon on line, and then it'll give you a line number. Now, with semicolons especially, the line number it gives you will be after the missing semicolon. So you often have to not look at the line that it's saying, but look at the lines above it to see where the error actually is, because that's where what PHP is giving you is the line number of where it encountered an error, not where the error actually is. So that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're looking at those error messages that pop up, that the actual error may occur before that line. All right, so a notice. Notices and warnings. I just have notices for this. So a notice, again, is an improper way of coding. It's not really an error. PHP will continue running and it'll complete the applications as much as it can, but it's letting you know, hey, you have some really sloppy code and you might want to fix it. So an example, most common example of a notice is to echo out an array. And you can't do that. If you watch the video from last week, the echo statement on an array will cause a notice because it will attempt to do an array to string conversion, which doesn't work. So instead of using echo, we want to make sure we use print R, or you can use var dump as well. Both of those will output an array for us, but we cannot use the echo statement. Right? And again, that will create a notice. And again, notices aren't errors per se because the program won't halt, it will continue, but it is to let you know that you're doing something wrong. Okay, and the last one is deprecated. And with the deprecated, it's typically that we're using a function that was in an older version of PHP, but that will be removed from PHP soon or in the future. So an example of that is the each function. This is an older function inside of PHP, which has been marked deprecated and will be removed in future versions of PHP. So typically this won't be deprecated. Is something you generally won't need to be concerned about, but if you do run into a function that's been deprecated, generally there will be an alternative function that will serve the same purpose. So you'll want to look at the documentation to find out which function you need to find. But generally, again, you're not going to run into deprecated functions very often. Okay, so we learned about the different types of errors and where to look for errors. Now what happens when we encounter error, how do we find it? This is particularly true of not just your syntax and fatal errors. They're easier to find because we have line numbers. We get an error with a line number, and we can hunt down where in our code that is. This is more for when we have logic errors in our code. How do we kind of debug things? In JavaScript, we would use the console for this. We'd use console log, and we would output things to the console to kind of see where our logic error might be. In PHP, we don't have a console. We use the browser as our console, so we need to output things to the browser. And one way, of course, the simplest way to output something to the browser is to use echo. So you can just echo out text or even a variable to see what you're getting, to see how it's progressing through the code. That can help you with the error. Now, echo is pretty limited, and it doesn't work with arrays, so you might have to rely on print R. Print R prints a human readable version of the code or the variable or the value, and it does work with an array. But it doesn't give you a whole lot of data, and that's where var dump comes in. So var dump will give you even more data than print R. It generally gives you the data type of a value as well as its length and additional data as well. So var dump is generally what you want to use when you're debugging your code. You can use var dump on variables or values to kind of see what's going to happen. The next function I have here is get type. This is a way of just getting the data type of a variable. Now, PHP, like JavaScript, is a loose typed language, which means a variable can hold different data types. It's not static. It's not like we set this will always be an array and it can't hold anything else, like in some languages like Java. But in PHP, it's loose type, so we can switch its data types. So it can be important to check what data type a variable is having. If you're expecting a variable to be holding a number, and in fact, it's holding a string, that can cause logic errors. It can cause problems in your application. So checking its type can be very handy. This last one that I'm showing you is get defined vars. So what this will do is if you were to call this function, it will output every single variable that has been defined in the PHP application. That's variables defined by your application as well as by PHP itself. So it can be a quite long list, but this can be very handy to see what is being defined and see if there's some sort of conflict there. All right, so that is sort of the end of the debugging section. Are there any questions? It's a very quiet group today. Okay. If there are no other questions, let's go ahead and jump into your assignments for this week. So the first one I want to talk about is deck of cards. Now this is a lab, so it is considered a participation assignment. It is a GitHub Classroom assignment, so it will have the link for the GitHub Classroom. You will need to accept that assignment, and you will then be able to download the repository to your machine. There will be some starter files in there that you will need to use to complete the assignment. For this assignment, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using arrays and loops to generate all 52 cards of a standard deck. So we're talking about the decks with the 4 suits, the clubs, diamonds, hearts, and spades, and then with the 13 ranks. So you're going to be creating all 52 cards with that. Then you're going to be creating using the rand function to generate 52 random cards. So the first one is all 52 cards, and the other one is 52 random cards. So you can duplicate cards in the random function, but you're just developing random cards there. You'll want to provide some comments and pseudocode for this assignment. It is part of the grade. And then you'll submit the URL to submit the repository URL to Brightspace. Now, there is a solution video for this assignment. So typically, if we were meeting in person, this is the type of assignment I would do in class with you. But over Zoom, that's not really feasible. So I have pre-recorded a solution video for you, and it is available on the assignment page now. So you can watch that video. I do encourage you to attempt this assignment before looking at the solution video, just to see how much you can do, and then go in and watch the video. This will be due June 3rd, so that's next week. So you have a week to get that done. Your other assignment for this week is dominoes. This is also a GitHub Classroom assignment, and this is an exercise. And what you're going to be doing for this assignment is you're going to be using using loops and array to generate 100 random dominoes. Now I'm providing you with the HTML template and the CSS. All you need to do for this assignment is to create the PHP that will output the proper HTML. You will be using the rand function to randomize the dominoes. And then you'll use the CSS classes that are provided, this along with the HTML template, which I provide for you. You'll submit the repository URL to Brightspace, and this is also due next week. So both of those are due at the same time. All right, so any questions about your assignments?
I have a question about when we code for PHP, we need a server to test our the. So do we gonna like go through the how do we use this the server local
Right.
server?
That's an excellent question. So I have created two videos for how to, so I have some videos showing you how to get started with PHP. Those are under week 1, or if you go to the recordings page, actually, let me show you. It'd probably be easier for me to just show you. Okay, so here we are. Here is the MTM6405, the server-side web development website. And I'm just going to go to the content page. So under week 1, we have our content from last week. There is also under the recording section, I have the lecture 1 recording. So that's the recording from last week. And then I have this get started with PHP on Mac OS and on Windows. So I do walk through kind of the process of getting started with PHP on both operating systems. Now, for week 2, again, we have the topics that we covered today, as well as the assignments. And under the recordings, I have working with GitHub Classroom. So what this will do is this will show you how to, it'll explain that you need to accept the GitHub Classroom. It's very similar to Introduction to JavaScript, so you should be able to follow along with that. But it will talk about how you clone down the repository and where you need to save it for each operating system, either Mac OS or Windows, depending on your operating system. And then it'll show you how to get started with that. Now, with the deck of cards, let me open this assignment. Right here, by the way, is your GitHub Classroom assignment link. So each assignment that is a GitHub Classroom assignment will have this red box at the top and the link to the assignment to accept it. So right here is the solution. So this video, I walk through how to work on the deck of cards assignment. So you can watch that video to figure out or to walk through the solution for the deck of cards. And that should also help you for your Dominoes assignment. Okay, so that's an excellent question. Any other questions? All right, so like I said, both assignments will be due next week, June 3rd at 11:59 p.m. All right, so that concludes this lecture. So for next time, we are going to be covering PHP requests and PHP includes. So two very big topics that will be new to you because there's no really equivalent to that in JavaScript. So these are PHP specific topics. And we will have a participation exercise that will be assigned as well as an exercise. So that's what we're going to be, or that's what you can expect next week. Are there any final questions? How's everyone feeling about the class so far? Are we good? Feeling good? Feeling confident? Scared? Terrified?
Feeling good.
It's good.
Yeah, doing
So
good.
far, so good.
Yeah, but I think maybe we'll mix up JavaScript and PHP. I think so from my side. I'm going to do that for sure.
Yes, yes. When you're jumping between the languages, it can get confusing, especially for those of you who are also in my web production where we're working with JavaScript. Yeah, it can get rough when you're learning both languages.
Yes, because the syntax and everything is so different and we are doing both the languages at the same time.
Yes, yes.
It's going to be difficult.
All right, so that is all I have for
And
this.
just one question.
Go ahead.
You know how in JavaScript, how when you're to like check to see what's on your screen, you would press like the live serve or whatever button, and in PHP, there's like a different thing we got to do.
Right.
And
So
learn on?
when,
know.
depending on your operating system, and in those videos, I do kind of demonstrate how you need to do that. But depending on your operating system, you will type in a URL. And actually, the way I've set it up, if you follow the development tools instructions, both operating systems will type in the same URL as long as you're saving your projects in the MTM6405 folder, which you were supposed to create. You will then go in your browser to mtm6405.test. And anything you'll have access to any site inside that folder through that URL. And that's how we will test it. And again, it's a little different. We can't use live serve for PHP because we have to go through that PHP server.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks.
All right, so again, if that's all I have, I will stick around for a little while and stay online if you have any questions, but if you don't, you are free to go. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.